spring of 1861, the Stone household had turned solemn. The war had arrived in Mobile, unwelcomed but here nonetheless. There was no cannon fire or smoke to announce its arrival, but the impact was felt with the quiet resolve of Sardine's sons preparing to leave. All of his boys chose the Confederacy, but they were not all driven by the same fire. One marched out of conviction. Two out of duty. A fourth, perhaps, because he could not bear to be the only one left behind. Whatever their reasons, they signed their names and shouldered their packs. First in line was John Woodson Stone, who was the eldest, and thus carried the weight the way a river bears its current, quietly, without ceremony, a force beneath the surface. He was 26 when the war reached the boiling point, and by then, most of his brothers were already committed. He'd watched them leave, one by one, each with their own fire, each with their own cause. But John held back for many reasons. One, most likely, was his wife, Julian Cora Wilson, whom he had married on March 14, 1859, in Montgomery, Alabama. Their matrimonial rites were followed shortly afterwards by the birth of his daughter Willie, that same year. He wasn't afraid. That wasn't it. He simply didn't believe in rushing headlong into chaos for the sake of appearance. He was his father's son, after all, steady, deliberate, and burdened with the sense that not all things noble were wise, and not all wars just. Still, the world pressed in. The streets of Mobile buzzed with news and outrage as John sat on the porch most nights, listening to the wind push across the bay above the dark line of the water. It wasn't until March 1, 1862, nearly a year after the first volleys at Fort Sumter, that he enlisted. He signed his name at the Mobile courthouse, his pen moving slowly, carefully, as though each letter bore the weight of a promise. He chose Company C of the 2nd Infantry Regiment, Alabama Volunteer Militia, a Gulf Coast defense unit raised by the state of Alabama. The regiment was already at Fort Morgan, as of April 1861, although Company C was still recruiting. These weren't boys rushing to Virginia. These were older men, local men, tasked with guarding the shoreline, not storming it. But they would return to protect Mobile eventually when recalled. On April 5, his company was ordered to Fort Gaines. The old brick sentinel crouched low on Dauphin Island, watching the mouth of Mobile Bay. The fort was damp, isolated, and smelled of salt, powder, and rust. The walls echoed with gull cries and the barked orders of Brigadier General Thomas J. Butler, who ran his command with rigid precision. John kept to himself mostly. He wrote letters home, when his duties allowed, and read the Psalms by candlelight in his tent. He wasn't chasing medals or myths. He just believed that if duty called, it was better to answer than to hide. And though his brothers fought in the wild chaos of open fields and upon distant seas, John's war would be different, quiet, watchful, and rooted to the edge of the Gulf, where tides rose and fell and the guns stood ever silent, waiting. As for Captain Sardine's second son, Frank Singleton Stone, he was not a man built for war, but like many of his kind, he went anyway, and was determined to do his part. In 1862, John found that his duty at Fort Gaines was very monotonous to say the least, amid the poor living conditions, disease, and supply shortages. During the summer months, they lived in white canvas tents that offered very little protection from the weather. At one time, they built log huts with small fireplaces that kept them somewhat warm during the winter months. There was some room available inside the unfinished fort, but there was still little comfort there. Another frailty was the compression of so many men into a small space, which increased the threat of disease. Diseases such as dysentery, diarrhea, and typhoid fever spread rapidly, compounded by the poor sanitation, such as the contaminated food and water. Rations were meager and usually consisted of hardtack, salt pork, and cornmeal day in and day out. Their uniforms were threadbare and hardly even looked like uniforms. Also, the monotony was so bad that they even looked forward to the occasional mortar and artillery bombardments provided to them by the Union's picket boats. Born in 1839, Frank had inherited his father's keen eyes and patient hands. He moved through the world with the precision of a surveyor and the quiet grace of a man more interested in function than spectacle. While others brawled over politics, Frank measured boiler pressure and memorized river maps. While the streets of Mobile began to fill with the rumblings of discontent, he worked the river and read books late into the night by lamplight. At 12, when most boys were still skipping stones on the riverbank or chasing marbles through alleyways, Frank was sent far north to the clamor and cold discipline of Jeffersonville, Indiana, apprentice to the Howard Brothers shipyard. It was not punishment, but preparation. Sardine believed in shaping his sons like he shaped his boats, early and with intention. There, Frank apprenticed under the stern hands of James and Daniel Howard at their famed Jeffersonville shipyard, a place where timber echoed with hammer blows and steam hissed like breath from iron lungs. The Howards had built ships since 1834, and their vessels were known from Cincinnati to New Orleans. Young Frank swept their decks, oiled gears, studied hull curves, and absorbed everything he could from the men who worked with measured pride. This was the famed shipyard of James and Daniel Howard in Jeffersonville, Indiana, where Frank apprenticed on his road to become the heir of his father's steamboat legacy. There is no indication as to why Frank was selected over his brothers John, Sardine, or Thomas. Perhaps their interests lay elsewhere, or maybe Frank's mechanical aptitude surfaced earlier than the others. Regardless, Frank became the chosen son, a decision that would bear fruit after the war. At that time, only John and Thomas would follow in Frank's footsteps while Sardine headed in another direction. One would have thought that John, being the oldest, would have been so inclined, but Frank seemed to be the one that possessed a business acumen rather than the others. However, all of the elder Sardine's plans were now for naught. In Indiana, he learned the language of lumber and line, of iron rivets and steam. The hammer became his metronome. The dry dock became his chapel. When he returned home, he brought with him more than just skill, he brought respect. Men twice his age listened when he spoke. Time passed among the sounds of saws and rivets. And when Frank returned to the South, he carried with him more than just callous and mechanical knowledge, he carried a sense of direction. He would complete his education in Mississippi under the guidance of Alexander Demetri Left, the revered linguist and scholar, where discipline of the mind was as prized as discipline of the hand. After Mississippi, he returned to Mobile. Frank was no longer a boy, but a man with a purpose. He took a clerkship at the William H. Redwood Company, as a cotton buyer, stacking ledgers and managing cargo manifests along the bustling riverfront. There he learned all there was to know about cotton. But it wasn't long before the river called him to something more than just paperwork. In 1855, he took his first real step toward his riverborne future, second clerk aboard the steamboat Ben Lee, a familiar sight along the Tombigbee. There, on the slow current of the winding river, Frank found his rhythm. He learned the routes, the men, the moods of the river. He learned to listen to engines, to weather, and to the silence between. But all of that, the ledgers, the cargo, the sound of water under his hull, was now threatened by the ever-rising tide of war. He did not enlist in the infantry or cavalry like so many others, and like his brother it was not out of fear, but out of duty to a different calling. His hands were made for rudders and registers, not rifles. He knew the South was going to desperately need its steamers to transport its troops and supplies upon its inland waterways. This was where the decisive battles would be fought and won, not upon the open seas. Of course, there were other, more personal issues to consider as well. Enlisting in the Transportation Corps ensured he would be operating out of his hometown of Mobile, and yet still providing a vital service to his country. And then, like his brother John, there was his marital life to ponder. He, too, was betrothed to marry Mary Elizabeth Hawkins, the daughter of Dr. Augustus C. and Eliza Waterman Hawkins. As it was, the marriage was delayed until September 4, 1862, as Frank took up the call to arms to defend his state. Duty before love. Like many young men in every generation, the uncertainty of war brought about a strong desire for the need to have a waiting family at home should they survive. But like John, Frank would now have the privilege of knowing he would be serving the Confederacy in his local waters, and not some distant battlefield far from home. So, for Mary, a hug and a kiss would have to suffice as she watched Frank's slow, deliberate step walking up the gangplank, a man who did not believe in violence, but believed in loyalty even more. As the war progressed, the quiet Clark was appointed a Confederate quartermaster, and by 1864, a captain of the Confederate steamer Admiral, the first in what would become a long and proud line of riverboats under his command. The movement of troops and supplies, at times, had become more important than a division of infantry. But Frank never spoke of glory. Only of duty, and of the river. But if John was the pillar and Frank the architect, then the third son, Sardine Graham Stone Jr., was the flame, the one always dancing just ahead of the wind, never still, never satisfied. At 20, young Sardine was already a seaman aboard the local steamers, and, like his brothers, was already following in his father's footsteps. Sardine had his father's name and his fire, but none of his patience. The paddle-wheel life, so dignified and dependable to the elder Stone, felt like a cage to the younger. Sardine Jr. needed more than riverbanks. He wanted oceans. He wanted sails snapping in the open wind, rigging creaking overhead, horizon stretching past his waiting grasp. Attendance at the University of Tennessee had offered him little more than a pause. He stayed only a year before Congressman Percy Walker endorsed him for acceptance into the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1857, where the sea finally became a vision. There, amid drills and discipline, charts and salt-slick mornings, Sardine Jr. had found what he believed to be his true course. But then, like a sudden squall over clear water, everything changed. Note the jaunty posture of the 1861 midshipman at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. The original naval school was converted into the Annapolis Academy in 1850. The new school set up a curriculum comprised of 4 years of study, with each summer requiring training aboard actual ships. This format is still in effect today. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 brought the gathering storm into full view. By December 20, South Carolina had seceded, and every midshipman in Annapolis was asked, though not always gently, to choose loyalty or duty, the Union or the South, allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, or to the soil that bore their family's name. But young Sardine watched and waited, restless but unmoved, until January 11, 1861, when Alabama followed South Carolina into secession. Only months away from graduation, that was all he needed. 2 days later, he resigned his commission from the U.S. Navy, packed what he could into a trunk, and left the academy grounds without a backward glance. But he was not the last to go. Many followed, some out of duty, others out of pride, and still others driven by the same deep ache Sardine carried in his chest, the ache to belong to something bold and unyielding. Each cadet stood at a crossroads, torn between honoring their oath to the United States or remaining loyal to their home state and family. Late-night meetings became the norm, as rumors swirled and uncertainty thickened the air. They waited, restless and watchful, to see what course their individual states would take. Heated arguments erupted, passionate debates weighing loyalty against principle, identity against allegiance. Go or stay. Each knew that whatever they chose, the decision would shape them forever. Some were certain they would die. All understood they would never be the same. But Sardine had made his decision, and he would live by it. He headed home. In the end, one by one, every cadet from a southern state resigned from the academy and returned home to offer his services to his native soil. Those from northern states remained, just as steadfast in their loyalty to the Union. Tragically, many of these young men would meet again, not as classmates, but as enemies, on bloody fields of battle. Whether by sea or by land, it mattered not. The bond once forged in brotherhood would now be tested by war. Several of Sardine's classmates would go on to serve aboard the famous Confederate commerce raider, CSS Alabama, commanded by the renowned Captain Raphael Semmes. Following her legendary sea battle with the USS Kearsarge off the coast of France in 1864, the Alabama was sunk, 9 were killed, 10 drowned, and 21 were wounded. Among the wounded were Sardine's former classmates, Richard Fielder Armstrong of Georgia, and Joseph David Wilson of Florida. The fight between the famous commerce raider CSS Alabama and the USS Kearsarge took place on June 19, 1864, in international waters off the coast of France. As usual, the Confederate gunpowder and shells proved her undoing, due to their inferior quality, a problem for the South throughout the war. Finally, the fire from the Kearsarge struck home, and the Confederate raider began to take on water and sink. She would continue to fight until she sank, at which time Captain Semmes threw his sword into the sea and swam to the safety of a nearby sightseeing British yacht. Other classmates fought elsewhere, such as John Henry Comstock of Louisiana, who served aboard the CSS Selma in the Great Battle of Mobile Bay that same year, and was killed in action. Another classmate, John Feeney Holden of Tennessee, served on the commerce raider CSS Sumter, but tragically drowned on May 16, 1861. Two of Sardine's classmates from Mississippi, William Anderson Hicks and Albert Gallatin Hudgens, served faithfully aboard the CSS Sumter before transferring to her successor, the CSS Alabama. Both were captured during Alabama's fateful battle with the USS Kearsarge. Another was James A. Meriwether of Georgia, who was assigned to the Mobile Squadron, serving aboard the CSS Gaines, while Tennessee's Francis Thornton Chew took to the sea aboard the commerce raider CSS Shenandoah. It was Chew's ship that would receive credit for firing what is often considered the last shot of the Civil War, as they sent a warning shell across the bow of a Union whaling ship in the Aleutian Islands, months after the war had officially ended. Sardine would lose yet another friend and classmate in the conflict. On February 16, 1862, William Congreve Jackson of Virginia was killed in action during a Confederate raid on Elizabeth City, North Carolina, while serving aboard the gunboat CSS Ellis. In the end, the prophecy of those late-night sessions proved true. Some died. Some were wounded. Others were captured. But all were changed, marked forever by the choices they made in the war they could not escape. As for Sardine, on April 13, 1861, he was officially commissioned as a lieutenant in the Confederate States Navy and attached to the CSS McRae, a lean seagoing gunboat patrolling southern waters. However, On September 12, 1861, he was transferred to the Confederate ironclad CSS Manassas. The fourth and youngest of the Stone warriors, at 16 years of age, was the progenitor of our family line. He was Thomas David Stone, who was determined to follow his brothers in protecting his beloved Alabama. Each son was steadfast in their loyalty, but each had to choose their own path to fulfillment. Photo is a recreation from an old photograph. But for young Thomas, born in 1845, the days moved with everlasting slowness. Watching and listening to his older brothers talk of their enlistments and the coming maelstrom, Thomas could do nothing but pace the floor of his father's living room, the old wooden boards creaking beneath his boots. He devoured the Mobile newspapers daily with a desperate hunger, reading and rereading their words as though each sentence contained some secret that would give him a glimpse of what life would be like if he enlisted. His family preached to him against such a hasty and impulsive decision at his age, advising him that there would be time to fulfill his patriotism later. But patience is not a virtue granted to a 16-year-old. He kept thinking about John, now somewhere along the Gulf Coast, engaged in the war's rough and unforgiving terrain. He thought of Frank, now busy on his steamboats, running troops and supplies up and down the rivers, keeping the Confederate war effort moving. Their letters spoke of the work they were doing, the challenges they faced, but most of all, they spoke of purpose. They were where they needed to be, doing what they were meant to do. And Thomas? He was here. Still at home. Waiting. The more he read his brother's words, the more he imagined himself alongside them. His mind would drift into a daydream, fantasizing about the time when he would finally be called to join the fight. What would it be like, he wondered? Would he be given a ship like Sardine's Manassas? Or would he be posted with John, helping to defend the Gulf in a desperate battle? Maybe he would be running troops like Frank, working in the thick of it, ensuring that the troops had everything they needed to stay in the fight. The possibilities played out in his head, each grander than the last. Why? Because that's what 16-year-old boys do. When he couldn't stand it any longer, Thomas shocked his family by traveling across the bay to Fort Morgan and enlisting on April 9, 1861, in Company F of the 21st Alabama Infantry Regiment known as the Baldwin Rifles. Everyone had expected the Navy when the time came, but not the infantry. Patriotism had become a religion at this point in the war. Bands were playing, speeches were made, and anyone not immediately enlisting had their manhood questioned. Any perceived reluctance to enlist would have a woman's corset found on the young man's doorstep in the morning. Young Thomas succumbed to the South's fervor and patriotism, as it called forth its youth in the name of states' rights. The South had been economically exploited for generations by the exporters and bankers of the North. So there was already a distrust between the two sections of the country, and it only required a spark to ignite the powder keg. Abraham's election to the presidency was just such a spark. Sadly, the South never really had a chance given the North's industrial might and superior population of which to draw their recruits from. Without ever realizing it, Thomas had volunteered to cast his fate to the winds of war, already lost. The South's nationalism had reached a fever pitch. No wonder that Thomas had joined the fray at such a young age. But now his fate was in God's hands. Sardine Sr.'s fifth son by Sarah Ann, Augustus Bosworth Stone, was born in 1854, far too young to serve in the war. So, holding tight to her young son, Sarah stood on the porch and watched her four stepsons leave for God knows what and where, for the sake of honor and duty, each wondering if they would ever return. But, like hundreds of other mothers across the nation, there was nothing she could do but pray. 5 sons. 4 uniforms. 1 war. Sadly, Sardine, at 47 years of age, watched them go, proud, but silent in his worry. He saw that it had become a war that would take everything and leave nothing in return. This he knew, but no one was listening in April of 1861. On the nights he guided his steamer through the black waters of the Tombigbee River, he found himself staring out into the darkness and thinking. Thoughts and emotions running through his mind like horses racing for the finish line. How did we get here, and what cost would his family be required to pay? He knew in his heart that the Stones of Mobile had not gone to war for conquest, nor out of hatred for the Union they had once embraced. Rather, they fought for what they believed to be the sovereign right of a state to withdraw from a union it had voluntarily entered. To them, it was a matter of principle, a defense of self-determination, not aggression. But the contradiction at the heart of the Confederacy was impossible to ignore. That same right of a state to secede clashed irreconcilably with the denial of liberty by the enslavement of other human beings. Freedom for one could not coexist with bondage for the other. These two ideals, state sovereignty and human rights, were locked in fatal opposition, and the only resolution, it seemed, lay on the blood-soaked soil of far-off battlefields. Before its conclusion, more than 615,000 men would have to die for the sake of deciding the outcome of that question. As he saw the conflict beginning, the elder Sardine already knew his health was declining after a lifetime of labor and hardship on the rivers. Once a robust deckhand, Sardine had spent decades battling the currents of the Mississippi and its tributaries, hauling freight, driving timber, and forging paths where few dared to go. But time and hard labor had taken their toll. His joints ached, his breath came shorter with each passing season, and his once powerful frame no longer carried the strength of youth. Though his heart still beat with the fire of a fighter, he knew his days were numbered. So, this war would have to be borne by his son's generation, as every war in the past. So, staring off into the waters of the Tombigbee on his nightly voyages, it was his sons, raised on the muddy banks of southern rivers and steeped in the values of duty and staunch independence, that would have to choose their own path in a war that pitched both states and families against each other. So now, they each had decided their own fate, so God go with them. Back in Mobile, Sarah managed the household while her husband continued his work on the river, where Union blockades and shifting allegiances made every journey a calculated risk. The war had reached the rivers too, and even commerce carried a scent of gunpowder. The stage was now set, and both sides began preparing for total war. Leaders were selected, recruiting stations were set up, and newspapers were calling for volunteers. The Southerners, basking in their own delusions, announced with patriotic fervor that the war would be over in 3 months. No one paid a bit of attention to the industrial might of the North versus the rural culture of the South. Even the population of the North was overwhelming compared to that of their Southern brethren. But no one paid attention. No one listened. The year 1861 came to a close as both sides aligned their forces without the foggiest idea of what they had started. Most families, including the Stones, were waiting breathlessly for what they feared was coming. The Union had wasted no time in blockading the southern shorelines and ports with their large navy. New Orleans was on top of their lists for invasion because it was the gateway to the Mississippi. But the southern forts in the Mississippi Delta prevented them from passing any further north to accomplish that goal. To prevent such an occurrence, the Confederates decided on a preemptive strike that became known as the Battle of the Head Passes. Fortunately, the elder Sardine had long been entrenched in the maritime community, with a solid reputation among those who sailed the rivers, coasts, and harbors of the South. His network of contacts ran deep, and from them, he often learned of future developments before they hit the newspapers or the telegrams. It was through these connections that he had heard whispers of an impending clash, one that would soon embroil the Confederacy's naval forces in the lower Mississippi area. He knew there was a battle on the horizon, one that could determine the fate of the river itself. The Union Navy had set its sights on the confluence of the three main passes of the Mississippi River, a strategic point that would allow them to control not only the river, but the very heart of the Confederacy's supply lines. If they managed to establish a permanent base there, it would mean disaster for the Southern cause. The elder Sardine knew this. And he knew his son, Sardine Jr., would soon be in the thick of it. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the clouds shift across the sky, his thoughts heavy. It wouldn't be long before his boy was drawn into the battle that was now building to the west. The letters young Sardine had sent the past months had painted a picture of a young man eager for action and the chance to prove himself. The CSS Manassas, the ironclad that Sardine had boasted of, was a key player in the battle to come. And it wasn't lost on him that his son, having just been assigned to the Manassas, would likely be heavily involved in the fight. The ship was named after the first major battle of the war, the previous July. The same battle that had given its first clue as to what the next 3 years would be like. Old Sardine had known that this day would come, when the war would bring them all closer to the heart of the conflict. But knowing it and living it were two different things. The elder Sardine had lived through conflict, but never had he felt the sting of it quite like this. Not with his sons now on the front lines. As he turned away from the window, his mind flashed back to the day young Sardine had been sent off to war. The pride he had felt was mixed with something deeper, a fear that would remain unspoken, but ever present. He had taught his sons the ways of the sea, of battle, of duty. But as every father knows, it's one thing to prepare your children for the world to come and another to send them into its chaos. In the meantime, the elder Sardine was working alongside his son Frank, assisting in the gathering of reinforcements and supplies in the event the Confederacy needed them. His connections, though useful, could only go so far. But he had done what he could, and now it was just a matter of waiting. Soon, he would be hearing word of his son's fate in the coming battle. He didn't know what news would come, or when, but he could already feel the heaviness of it in his bones. The night of October 12, 1861, dragged on with a weight of anxiety that hung over the house like a storm cloud. The elder Sardine had been in his study, pacing from one end to the other, much like his youngest, when a messenger arrived. His boots clacked across the wooden floor as he made his way to the door, his heart quickening with each step. The young messenger handed him a sealed letter, bearing the unmistakable mark of urgency. His father ripped it open, his eyes scanning the hurriedly written words. Attack imminent. The battle will begin at dawn. The Confederacy must hold the head of passes. More will follow as the situation develops. The ink seemed to blur before his eyes as the reality of the words sank in. The battle was not some distant, dramatic event anymore. It was here, now, on the verge of exploding into chaos just miles from where his son sailed on the Manassas. He knew that the Mississippi River was vital, but he also knew that his son was about to face something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Sleep was impossible. How could it not be, when the very air seemed thick with the uncertainty of what awaited the next day? His father could not shake the feeling that the outcome of this battle might decide more than just control of the river. It could decide whether his son would return home, or whether the Manassas would meet its bloody end amongst a hail of Union shells. Did the Confederate commander, Captain George N. Hollins left have a workable plan of attack? Or would it be a total disaster with his son's life hanging in the balance? The next morning, a chill settled over the house, even colder than the night before. The first word came in rushed, fragmented, and full of uncertainty. A naval battle was indeed underway at the head of passes. The Confederates were engaged, but the details were sparse. There was no certainty in the reports, no clarity in the outcome. Only that the clash of iron and steel had begun, and the fate of the Mississippi was still in the balance. Of course, he couldn't focus on anything else. He paced the length of the house, waiting for the next scrap of information, each passing moment like a blade cutting through his calm. He knew how the rumors would spread, how every whisper would be distorted by the fear and confusion of those caught up in the battle. What was fact? What was fiction? His mind raced through endless possibilities, none of them good. That night, as the clock ticked through the long, painful hours, there was still no word. Each minute felt like an eternity, and the silence between the visits of messengers only deepened his dread. Then, at last, the rumors began to pour in, riding the tide of hearsay and speculation, filling the air with a strange mixture of hope and fear. Some said the Manassas had fought bravely, engaging the Union ships in fierce battle. Others claimed the Confederate forces had held their ground, driving the Union back from the passes. Yet another voice spoke of chaos, of confusion on the water, of shots fired from every direction, leaving the outcome unclear. But none of the whispers could answer the one question that burned in the older Sardine's mind: what had happened to his son? The Manassas had launched a surprise attack on the Federal blockading squadron and rammed one of the Union ships, the USS Richmond. But did it work? Was it effective? Part of their plan was to create a distraction with the use of three-towed rafts that were tied together by cables and set afire. Then Sardine's name was mentioned by his father's informants, but in what capacity, he didn't know. Regardless, his information indicated that his son was safe, but the surprise attack had failed. That was all that his father was concerned about, as he breathed a sigh of relief. When next he saw his son, young Sardine excitedly told his parents how they had sailed south to launch a surprise attack on the Federal blockading squadron at the head of passes. In the ensuing battle, the Manassas had rammed the USS Richmond, but the impact was deflected by a coal barge tied alongside. Ironically, the Manassas suffered more damage in the ramming than the Richmond. They had lost her iron prow and smokestacks in the collision, and one of her two engines had broken loose from its mounting. The battle turned chaotic, as most battles do, as the Manassas maneuvered to ram the other Union ships, and those same ships were maneuvering to bring their own powerful guns to bear on her. The USS Preble and USS Richmond had then moved in with heavy shelling that glanced off her iron sides. Part of the plan was to tow three rafts tied together by cables and set them afire. The downriver current would carry them into the Union ships, whereby they would attack during the distraction. Aboard the Manassas, Sardine was ordered to signal the Southern fleet with rocket flares as soon as the rafts were cut loose. However, when he grabbed the wooden handle of the flare, it had scorched his hand, causing him to drop the flare down the hatch and into the ship. This, in turn, caused a temporary panic when the crew thought it was a live Union shell about to explode. Luckily, he had recovered his composure just in time to shoot off two flare rockets, as a signal to the CSS Hollin squadron that the burning rafts were on their way. However, the Union vessels were able to escape without any harm, and Sardine and his ship had been forced to withdraw. He also told his father that he had been mentioned in the after reports when, later in the cruise, he had shown his initiative in salvaging 2 of the heavy guns emplaced at Fort Randolph below Fort Pillow. The old man listened with rapt attention, with his chest almost bursting with pride at the recognition shown to his young son in the dispatches. While his brother was fighting the northern invaders on the Mississippi, Thomas Stone was finding that military life was nothing like what the recruiters had indicated. After being sworn in, he was sent to the large encampment at Camp Moore, the camp of instruction, which was a boot camp named after the Alabama governor Albert B. Moore. It was located down Hall's Mill Road along the back roads to the Dog River on the western shores of Mobile Bay. There, Thomas learned to march, maneuver, make an encampment, shoot from a prone and upright position, skirmish, clean his weapon, and cook. Many of the troops still had no weapons, and sometimes the ones they were issued were from the War of 1812 or the Mexican War. If nothing else was available, they were issued sticks for simulation during their marching drills. To relieve their boredom, they would go down to the shoreline and watch the Union blockading ships dueling with the shore batteries of Fort Morgan and Fort Gaines. They were exhilarated with their front row seats, never realizing the hell and fury they were soon to witness themselves. Over 200 of these young men would never live to hear the last bugle call in April. On November 15, 1861, the regiment received orders to pack up and report to Fort Gaines. They camped that night on the banks of the Dog River, then loaded the next day onto a steamer and sailed down the river to Mobile Bay, landing at Fort Gaines. Their orders were to switch camps with another regiment that embarked on the same clipper for the return trip to Camp Moore. The purpose of the switch was to provide a force to prevent or repel any Union landing force by Union forces west of Fort Gaines. Of course, this gave them a much better and closer look at the nightly naval cannonades with the Union gunboats, or when one of the blockade runners made a run past the Federal interceptors. They were encamped in tents scattered amongst the sand dunes around the fort, where the cold November winds found every crack in the canvas. Each day, a small bay steamer would make a call at the various encampments around the bay and pick up and deliver the mail. Sarah and his father wrote often, well knowing how bored Thomas must be. Then, a red-letter day occurred on December 9 when 2 Union picket ships open-fired on one of the patrolling Confederate gunboats, and Fort Morgan was obligated to fire in their defense. The episode quickly led to a dueling cannonade between the two forces. The Union ships were the frigate USS Potomac and the side-wheeler steamer USS Water Witch of the blockading squadron. The soldiers of the regiment sat on the walls and dunes and were thoroughly entertained as they watched the ships and the monstrous fort blasting away at each other at such close range. But the spectacle of the year commenced on December 24, when the regiment had the privilege of watching the blockade runner CSS Florida sail out of Mobile Bay and engage the Union picket steamer, USS Huntsville. A stiff battle ensued between the two combatants until both backed off. Other than these few duels, their duty was sheer boredom. Hopefully, Thomas was surely given occasional leave to visit his family, especially from such a well-known and influential family as the Stones. Now came the beginning of 1862, and with it the acceleration of the bloodshed, as both unprepared citizen armies clashed soon enough in mortal combat. The nation's more experienced and professional forces were small in comparison to what was soon to come. Both sides had the limited services of veterans of the Mexican War of 1846, but the armies of 100,000 or more soldiers had no such experience, nor did these green troops have any idea the scene of unimaginable carnage awaiting them just over the horizon. For John Woodson, nothing much would change. His regiment was still protecting the Gulf Coast with no serious incursions made by Union land forces. Frank was busy organizing the steamer corps to meet the needs of the Confederate forces building fortifications along the Mississippi and other major rivers. But for the two younger Stones, 1862 would be a wild ride. One would enter his second naval engagement soon enough upon the Mississippi, while the other would experience the bloodiest battle in American history and pay for it with his own blood. The dawning of the new year found young Sardine still aboard the CSS Manassas and on duty in the lower Mississippi Delta. She was the first ironclad ever built for the Confederacy and was covered with 1¼ inch iron plating in the shape of a turtleback so that enemy rounds would glance off her. She was 143 feet long with a 33-foot beam and an 11-foot draft. The Manassas was probably more a ram than an ironclad. Her pointed iron ram on her bow also carried a single forward-firing cannon with an armored shutter. Her low profile in the water would make her a difficult target to strike by any of the encircling Union ships. Their first engagement had been a draw with very little damage inflicted by either side. But her captain and crew were itching for another chance to show their mettle to the northern aggressors. But by 1862, the die had been cast, and it was too late for last-minute negotiations. The conflict would now have to run its course to its bloody end. The Stone cousins of New England and their cousins in the South were now on a collision course, where death waited at the end to claim its expected victims. The intensity of the battles began to increase as huge armies clashed for days, giving way to longer and longer casualty lists. Major battles such as Second Manassas, Seven Pines, 7 Days, Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, Malvern Hill, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. All bloodbaths. But for the 21st Regiment in Alabama, it was business as usual. Boredom upon boredom. Then on February 21st, the regiment was ordered back to Hall's Mill, so they marched back to the steamer and slowly embarked. But this time it was for a new encampment called Camp Memminger. Unfortunately, less than a week later, a huge tornado struck their new camp on February 26 and leveled every tent in the area, plus the wooden hospital building. The patients inside were trapped under the collapsed wreckage and screaming for help. Everyone pitched in and hurriedly pulled the debris off the helpless men, but 2 had already been crushed to death and were beyond saving. Shortly afterwards, they were assigned to the Army of Mobile under General Jones Mitchell Withers, where they were to assist in the guarding of the Gulf Coast. These units were then scattered around Mobile Bay in such places as Fort Gaines, Fort Morgan, Camp Anderson, Camp Governor Moore, Camp Bragg, Camp Memminger, and Hall's Mill. Then things changed rather quickly, as word was received that the Union forces were gathering at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee. It was originally meant to establish a base of operations to strike at the surrounding railroads, but the operation quickly turned into a full-fledged offensive into the southern interior. To fulfill this purpose, General Don Carlos Buell's 50,000-man force in Nashville was ordered to march out and join General Ulysses Grant and his 50,000 men for a joint offensive. But Buell moved so slowly through the backwoods that Grant was forced to sit and wait. Some of his soldiers were so bored that they dug up 3 dead Confederates buried after they were killed in a skirmish just to see what they looked like. While Grant's forces were still waiting for their reinforcements to arrive, the Confederate High Command felt it would be the perfect time for Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston's army to strike. Confederate commanders began pulling in Southern troops from as far away as Pensacola, Florida, and Mobile, Alabama. Thomas and his comrades of the 21st Alabama were elated. No more boring camp life, now they would become real soldiers. They would now embrace the glorious war they had been reading about for so long. They were going to fight a great and magnificent battle, as they marched off to protect the honor of the South. Like all young men, death and destruction were far from their minds as they boarded the train and chugged out of Mobile, singing merrily all the way. Thomas' parents had seen him off at the station with Augustus in tow, but Frank had not been able to join them. Hugs and kisses were shared all around, and then the sweet goodbye wave as the train built up steam and headed north. There is no way to describe that feeling that a parent has as they say goodbye to their child going to war. Only those who have been there know. The young men's newfound exhilaration slowly evaporated as the soldiers became bored with the monotonous scenery from the train. They saw mile after mile of pine forests interrupted occasionally by small, scattered farms. The train traveled between 6 and 10 miles per hour and had to stop every 15 to 20 miles to replenish its wood and water for the engine, while the men took the opportunity to stretch. The recent rains had damaged some of the tracks, so the trains were forced to travel by daylight to avoid any accidents that might further delay the troop movements. In addition to the torrential rains, they were also having mechanical problems with their locomotive, greatly delaying their arrival in Corinth, Mississippi. The North's railroad system were far superior to that of the South, which hampered their troop movement throughout the war. For instance, the South had far fewer miles of track that limited their moving troops and supplies where they were needed the most. Many of their tracks were not connected to each other rather than a standard system. The North had a standard gauge of 4 feet, 8.5 inches, whereas the South had different gauges preventing their locomotives from being able to travel from one system to another. Repair of damaged or worn-out rails was also very difficult without an organized maintenance department. Fortunately, the Southern citizens were waiting at every station to cheer them on. Women threw flowers and kisses while others gave them cakes, cookies, and fruit tarts to eat on their noble journey. They slowly made their way through Alabama and Mississippi, passing such small rural towns as Citronella, State Line, Tupelo, Saltillo, Guntown, Boonville, and Rienzi, before finally pulling into the huge encampment in Corinth late in the afternoon. It was then that Thomas and his regiment saw the first inkling of the massive and unbelievable confusion between the Confederate general, Albert Johnson, and his field commanders. Then on March 3, General Beauregard ordered the 1st, 2nd, and 21st Alabama regiments to Fort Pillow on the Mississippi River, north of Memphis. They were hustled off their train from Mobile and quickly marched to the Corinth depot, where they waited for the next train to Memphis. When it finally pulled into the station, they loaded up once again and continued their journey through western and northern Mississippi. The soldiers were no longer merry and had finally learned about the Army's standing order to hurry up and wait. By Friday evening of March 7, all 3 regiments had arrived in the town of Memphis by way of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. But before the week was out, Private Stone and the 21st Regiment, who were now at Fort Pillow, were awakened on Friday, March 14, and told to cook rations for 5 days. Unbeknownst to the men, the regiment had received new orders directing them to return to the encampments at Corinth, Mississippi, from whence they had just come. Needless to say, the griping of the soldiers had risen to a much higher crescendo, but would rise even higher in the very near future. So, the soldiers again packed up their belongings to include their heavy canvas tents, and trudged down the road to the banks of the river. The breaking of camp was completed in a drenching downpour, and when they approached the banks, the soldiers began slipping and sliding down the embankment with their heavy loads. Cold, muddy, and tired, the regiment worked all day loading the equipment onto the steamer, Scotchman, that was tied up to the wharf. The regiment finally finished loading on Saturday morning, and after embarking, they were packed so tightly that it was wall-to-wall soldiers. They sailed down river from Fort Pillow to Memphis and finally disembarked on Sunday, March 16, 1862. The trip was approximately 50 miles by the river, and did nothing but waste the time and resources of the three regiments and their supporting troops. They unloaded their gear and marched to the train depot, where they jumped aboard the all too familiar freight cars and headed the 97 miles eastward back down the tracks to Corinth. They arrived on Monday the 17th, and began the arduous task of unloading again and pitching their tents in their allotted section of the muddy encampment. The camp had become a wall-to-wall quagmire of mud so bad that the soldiers were forced to confiscate every plank, stick, or old railroad tie to lay on the ground to keep their bedding out of the watery ooze. The heavy rainfall, together with the crowded humanity, horses, and equipment, had turned the encampment into a sea of mud that manifested itself into a disease-ridden haven. Massive sickness was the order of the day. A large army of thousands of men along with their horses brought about an overwhelming amount of waste. Soon the feces ran off into the water supply and was mixed in with the mud to produce the horrible living conditions. But the dark cloud that seemed to follow the regiment everywhere they went still would not dissipate. No sooner had they settled down again than they were ordered to board a train the next day for Bethel Station, Tennessee, 22 miles north of Corinth. They again climbed aboard the freight cars and pulled out of camp, but as soon as they arrived at Bethel Station, they were ordered to immediately return to Corinth without ever disembarking. No regiment had a better understanding of just how confused the high command was than the 21st Alabama. 2 days later, the regiment was again ordered to move its camp from the south side of Corinth to an area on the north side. Here on March 24, they were finally brigaded with the troops commanded by General Adlai Gladden, along with the infantry regiments of the 22nd, 25th, 26th Alabama, and the 1st Louisiana, along with the artillery battery of Captain Felix H. Robertson. General Adlai H. Gladden impressed General Braxton Bragg after he defended Pensacola from a Union Army bombardment, as well as his efficiency in Mobile, Alabama. He took command of Thomas Stone's brigade in the Army of Mississippi, where he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Shiloh. As for Captain and later General Felix Huston Robinson, he was the only Texas-born general officer of the Confederacy. He was also the last surviving general of the Confederate Army. His father, Jerome Bonaparte Robinson, was also an officer in the war. Unfortunately for the South, General Albert Sidney Johnston was not Robert E. Lee. Johnston was not a man who could think quickly on his feet or make decisions without seeking the constant reassurance and advice from his staff. To win this battle, the Confederates had to strike quickly before General Grant and Buell could consolidate their forces. Even though Thursday, April 3, had been selected for their departure date from Corinth, little preparation had been made beforehand. Troop movements and marching orders were still being written into the early morning hours. By the appointed hour, the streets of Corinth were clogged with troops, wagons, and field guns. But still the army sat and waited. General Bragg, as befitted his personality, pointed fingers of blame at everyone, even General Hardee's corps, while his own corps failed to move because of his staff's bungling and misinterpretation of his own poorly written orders. By late afternoon, orders finally arrived, and the troops filed out of Corinth by way of Fillmore Street, but the orders of march were so confusing that many of the divisions wound up taking the wrong road out of Corinth. Sometime after the loss of Corinth, Mississippi, General Bragg replaced General Pierre G. Beauregard as commander of the Confederate Army of Mississippi, which was later renamed the Army of Tennessee. While Lee fought the Union with his Army of Northern Virginia, Bragg and his forces took on the enemy in the west. However, Bragg would become one of the most controversial commanders of the Civil War. He is said to have lost every battle he fought except one, but he did score partial victories, such as Perryville, Stones River, and Chickamauga, but was never able to follow through. This of course caused him to lose face with his able subordinates. They in turn were sick and tired of his bad temper and combative personality, always blaming others for his failure exactly like Shiloh. His communication and planning was also horrible, which cost the lives of thousands of badly needed soldiers. At times, his subordinates tried to get him removed, however he and President Jefferson Davis were old friends. After his complete failure at Chattanooga in November 1863, was he removed from command. But sadly, like a bad penny, he remained the military advisor of President Davis. In this position, he was still able to create controversy. He is also blamed for the removal of General Joseph E. Johnston, with himself placed back in command in 1865. By the first night, the army had not moved very far. But not far away from Thomas, slept a young, nervous 20-year-old soldier with the 6th Arkansas by the name of Private Henry M. Stanley. Little did Thomas know, this young man would make one of the last charges of the battle before the Union forces captured him on the second day. But in later life, he would gain fame by leading an expedition into the deepest part of Africa to locate a man by the name of Dr. David Livingstone. Upon finding him, he asked, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" In the meantime, a shipment of 10,000 Enfield rifles appeared suddenly out of nowhere, and were handed out to Thomas and his comrades. These were badly needed firearms for the battle 2 days hence. Of course, now many of the troops found themselves fighting with weapons they had never fired before and were unfamiliar with. This state of confusion was rapidly intensifying on the very eve of their greatest battle. Then it came time to move forward, so they quickly fell into line and moved out, constantly heading north toward Pittsburgh Landing. But the closer they got to their objective, the more confusing everything became. Each corps was trying to move its troops toward its assembly areas, but none knew where the others were. The 21st Regiment's designated route carried them through the thick woods, along rutted backwoods roads, for 2 or 3 miles, gradually getting closer to the enemy lines, or so they thought. But it was not to be. Instead, they were forced to bed down for another night. The next morning, on April 4th, the regiment was up at dawn, soaking wet, cold, and miserable. 2 of the men had made their bed in a depressed area that had slowly filled with water during the night. They had been so exhausted from the day's march that they had failed to notice their submersion until the early morning hours. Now wide awake and miserable, they quietly moved a little closer to the Union lines and laid down in the woods for the night near Mitchie's farm. Again, there was a torrential rain that began in the late afternoon and continued all night, as the young soldiers lay in the woods under whatever protection they could find. Thomas and his buddies remained restless and sleepless all night, thinking about the coming battle the next day. Hardly any had yet to experience combat, and wondered what it would be like to see the elephant, a term used to express the facing of their fear in battle. They were all hungry, with most of their food still stuck in the quartermaster wagons, which were nowhere to be found. And to make matters worse, the firewood was soaking wet. Thomas teamed up with several others to pool their meager resources for the betterment of all. They placed one of their oilcloths on the ground and used the other 3 to place a makeshift covering over their heads. Underneath their top, they combined their few parcels of food and ate every crumb, which was cold to the taste but filling to the stomach. For a while, they talked about the coming battle, but then one by one, they drifted off into a troubled slumber. Suddenly, they heard their sergeants bellowing orders to fall in and form up. It was 3 o'clock on Saturday morning of April 5, 1862, when their division formed ranks and marched forward past the intersection at Mitchie's farm. Things were no more organized now than they were during the entire march. But then the leading units of Polk's corps got tangled up with them and cut their division off from the rest of Bragg's corps. They marched all day, then stood in line for hours until they shuffled forward only to wait again. The officers rode back and forth, moving them this way and that, creating a comical but chaotic scene of total confusion. Finally, they were deployed on the right half of Bragg's second battle line. When it was discovered that the Union left extended far past the Confederate right, Gladden's entire brigade, including the 21st and 22nd Alabama, was moved from their place in the second line to a new position on the extreme right of the first line of battle. The brigade's formation left to right was the 1st Louisiana, 26th Alabama, 25th Alabama, 22nd Alabama, with the 21st Alabama on the extreme right as an anchor. Within the 21st Regiment, the company's line of battle from left to right was Company A, Company B, Company C, and so forth down the line. While waiting for the battle to begin, the men milled around talking softly to each other, some boasting about the feats of bravery they would soon perform, and others mumbling soft prayers to God for their survival. They gathered in small groups of 2 and 3 and mumbled constantly to each other. But as all of them jittered around nervously, there was still no gunfire erupting, no deafening artillery blasts, no sound of musketry, and no sound of men screaming in defiance. Down the line, Thomas could see the troops of the 22nd Alabama lined up in formation next to his own nervous regiment. Several times, he stepped out of line and waved to friends as they stood under their own regimental flags flapping in the morning breeze. They called out last-minute salutations and wishes for good luck and Godspeed in the coming battle, with each making promises to check on each other afterwards. The attack was originally set to commence at 8 o'clock that morning, but by 9:30 Bragg's other division, commanded by General Ruggles, had still not come up. By 4 p.m., they were still waiting, and it was obvious that it was too late to continue with their original battle plans. The men were already out of rations, and it was widely believed that the element of surprise had been lost. They were only 1.5 miles away from the Union lines, and some of the Southern soldiers had been firing their rifles in the air to ensure their powder was still dry from the rains. That night, the entire Confederate army slept within 2 miles of the Union lines, which were centered on a small backwoods chapel called Shiloh Church. On that clear and cold night of April 5, the troops settled down heedless of the horror awaiting them the next day. They heard the Yankee bands through the woods playing Home Sweet Home, with many too naive to realize that they would never see their sweet home again by the next day's end. By the next morning, Thomas and his messmates couldn't believe their enemy was still oblivious to their presence. The loss of surprise was going to make the fight even worse. And they could plainly see that there was no way that each corps, spread over a front of several miles, could traverse that type of terrain and still stay in formation. The result was that each corps would become intermingled with the other, causing a total breakdown in communication between the high command and their field commanders. This resulted in completely uncoordinated attacks against the heavily defended enemy works. Sadly, Sunday, April 6, 1862, began with the same degree of bungling that had characterized the entire operation from the beginning. That morning, the men of the 21st Alabama Regiment woke to eat a cold breakfast, not daring to light any fires for fear of being discovered by the enemy so close at hand. Their brigade was again placed in the second line of attack, but was moved to the front line when their commanders discovered that Hardee's corps did not extend to the Union left. The men fell nervously into line, shoulder to shoulder, and lined up behind their regimental colors. Thomas Stone looked to his right and left and sought comfort and encouragement from his comrades beside him. Everyone could feel death hanging in the air. Some of his messmates behind him were teasing him about being their shield against the Yankee bullets. But regardless of where they stood in the formation, their mouths were already dry with nervousness, and the day had hardly begun. Talk was growing thin and whispery, with little laughter along the line. Some were already absorbed in the arrangement of their clothing, tugging at crotches, or buttoning and unbuttoning and rebuttoning their short grey jackets. There was no chivalry in what was about to happen. These men were not prepared for battle. How could they? And many of them would soon be torn apart, eviscerated, decapitated, or blown into a fine red mist before the muzzles of their enemies' guns. With that a definite possibility, even buttoning their fly assumed the dignity of a final act. The sergeants were walking up and down bellowing to the men to straighten their lines, while others walked between the ranks yelling for the men to remember, to load and prime and to fire low into the enemy ranks. The men obeyed and pulled out their paper cartridges and tore off the paper tail with their fingers or teeth and poured the powder down the barrels of their Enfields. They dropped their mini balls down the barrel and pounded them home with their ramrods. As a unit, they pointed their rifles to the sky and cocked the hammers with their thumbs. They then placed a percussion cap onto the nipple before slowly lowering the hammer and coming to the position of order arms. The grey line then waited impatiently for their next orders. Finally, the captain yelled to the ranks, "Move out and keep those lines dressed," as Hardee's entire corps in the first line surged forward. Over 9,000 men walked shoulder to shoulder along a mile-and-a-half front. As they marched forward, Thomas and his comrades never realized that the real hell was yet to come. They shouted encouragement back and forth to each other as they jumped and climbed over obstacles in their way. At first, there appeared to be no reaction from the enemy, but they all knew that wouldn't last for long. Finally, the whistles of the 55 caliber mini balls flying past became noticeable, along with the screams of the overhead shells that made them instinctively duck their heads. But there was nowhere to hide, and no cover to protect them. Then came the unmistakable sound of men being hit by enemy rifle fire all up and down the line. The sound was like a whizzing, followed by a hollow thunk as the bullet slammed into flesh and bone. Gaps began to appear in their lines. The soldier standing right next to Thomas went down, with no sound but a shallow grunt. On the other side, another made a gurgling sound as he clutched his throat and dropped to the ground. Everyone around him was sprayed with blood as his severed artery gushed out his life. Then the orders came down the line: forward, quick time, march. And the boys stepped out smartly away from the man's twitching body and into the thick smoke. Somewhere in the confusion, a Yankee bullet fired at random and at no particular target struck their captain in the chest, killing him instantly. Then a sheet of fire seemed to leap out from the Union line that was now no more than several hundred yards away. It seemed to flash from one end of the line to the other. A single crash, louder, sharper than the cannon's roar, rolled across the field. Thomas heard something angry whiz by his left ear, a sound that was quickly becoming one solid roar. Obeying commands, Thomas raised his loaded musket to his shoulder, sighting along the shining barrel, and fired into the smoke and flame ahead. The Union defenders took tremendous casualties themselves, as the Southern forces poured rifle and artillery rounds back into their ranks. The enemy gave ground grudgingly and fell back slowly, inflicting casualties as they retreated. As the 21st Alabama advanced with their brigade, things quickly began to unravel. In their position on the far right of the Confederate line, they were opposing the U.S. 18th Missouri Infantry Regiment led by Colonel Madison Miller. As Hardee's line advanced, the topography forced all the formations to veer to the right, leaving a space between Gladden's brigade and Lick Creek. General Johnston saw their change of direction and improvised by sending in General Chalmers' Pensacola brigade to fill the gap. With each regiment walking side by side, they moved forward through the woods and underbrush, crossing several hills and ravines. As one regiment hit an obstacle, the others kept moving, causing the battle line to become further misaligned. When they finally emerged from the brush, the Union pickets quickly spread the word of their advance. Messages were sent to their artillery, who limbered up and open-fired on the advancing Gray lines. But their shots were too high and luckily passed over the regiment like screaming banshees. At approximately 8 o'clock that morning, they struck Miller's Missourians from the front and obliquely from the left, where they occupied the southern side of Spain's Field along the eastern Corinth Road. To close with their enemy, the brigade had to cross the Shallow Creek branch of Locust Grove and advance up a gentle slope that crested about 175 yards from the enemy line. As they crossed the summit, the line surged forward behind their regimental colors, while the color bearers ran madly ahead, as if the battle flag streaming above them could repel the whistling bullets all by itself. As each color bearer went down dead or dying, another one rushed forward to pick up the colors and continue the charge. In all, 6 color bearers were killed in quick succession. By this time, the Union artillery had found its range and was pouring round after round into the advancing formations. Near Thomas, a cannon shell struck a soldier square in the chest, cutting him in half before continuing through the ranks behind him. Thomas could hear the boys ahead of him going in as the Gray line erupted out of the smoke, with 1,000 throats issuing forth the terrifying and primal rebel yell. The famous rebel yell has never been able to be reproduced because no one today is alive who ever heard it, nor was it ever recorded in its primal state. In 1913, the old Gettysburg veterans tried to imitate it during their 50th battlefield reunion, but their voices were too weak and their motivation too feeble to again create that wondrous battle cry. It had a mixture of fear, pent-up anxiety, exultation, hatred, and a pinch of pure deviltry. The yell helped many of the apprehensive soldiers expend their fearful energy and elevated their martial spirit to a level needed for battle. The Union troops had their own style of yelling, but it was a far cry from the battle cry of the Southerners. Many a Yankee line of battle broke in panic when confronted with a charging Gray line of enraged devils following behind with their ear-piercing rebel yell. In the meantime, the 18th Missouri held their fire until the 21st Alabama had closed to within 100 yards and then opened with everything they had. To the left of the 18th Missouri was the 61st Illinois, and to their right was the 16th Wisconsin, which added its firepower to the increasing maelstrom. Even though huge gaps were blasted through their lines, the 21st Regiment continued forward into the storm of lead. The Tennessee boys of Chalmers' brigade, fighting next to the 21st Alabama, returned a tremendous volley, scattering the enemy's ranks with dead and wounded. Following the salvo, the Southerners gave the rebel yell and charged forward, driving the confused enemy soldiers back in chaos. The enemy fell back so quickly that the Confederates captured their entire artillery battery, a valued prize in any of the Civil War battles. The enemy even tried to hitch up their horses to the artillery pieces to save them, but the horses were shot down in their harnesses. Gladden's casualty-ridden brigade, containing the 21st Alabama, was left with only 1,500 men to confront 4,000 Union soldiers to their front. But as the 21st Alabama and their fellow regiments watched apprehensively, these troops, for some unexplained reason, remained immobile. The Napoleon 12-pound howitzer was the most common field piece used during the war. It had a bronze smooth-bore barrel that was highly effective with both solid shot or shell. When fired with canister at close ranges, these weapons were absolutely murderous. They weighed 2,600 pounds and required 6 horses to pull them. Now, Chalmers' men were out of ammunition, and Jackson's troops were famished and exhausted. They began to rifle through the enemy's tents looking for food and feasting on captured beef and coffee. While they were pursuing their culinary interests, a squad of Federal infantry marched up under a flag of truce. Honoring their white flag, they withheld their fire as the enemy soldiers approached. When they were within 50 feet or so, the Yankees opened fire on the unsuspecting and trusting Southerners, killing 2 and wounding several more. In a rage of betrayal, the infuriated Confederates mercilessly wiped them out to the last man for their dastardly and cowardly act. Quickly recognizing his precarious situation, General Grant ordered his senior commander, Benjamin Prentiss, to hold at all costs so that he could set up a defensive line closer to the river. This bloody piece of real estate, paid for by the lives of so many men, would forever be known as the Hornet's Nest. Here, Thomas and his brigade were in the hottest fighting of the entire battle. The field was shrouded in smoke, and through it, the Yankees could hear the rebel line coming with their barbaric screaming and their first deafening volley. The musketry became continuous, and the volleys of the companies merged into a roar broken only by the more isolated booming of the cannon and the occasional scream of the men struck down. The Federals held firm against one charge after another, leaving the ground strewn with the torn bodies of the Confederate dead and wounded. In one of those charges, Thomas David Stone in Company F felt something strike him in the chest with the force of a sledgehammer. The impact thrust his body backwards away from the advancing line and threw him solidly to the ground. He groaned loudly, calling for help as he slipped into the black void of unconsciousness. When he came to, his chest was racked with pain so intense, he could hardly breathe. In addition, he was unable to move his legs and thought perhaps he had been shot through the legs, although there was no pain. When he raised his head, he saw another soldier lying motionless over his legs, but still breathing and clutching his rifle. He was finally picked up and loaded onto a wagon that made its way to the rear. Private Stone would survive his wound and live to fight another day. Most of his comrades did not. A few minutes later, at 8:45, a cannon projectile struck down General Gladden and horribly mangled his left arm and shoulder. The general was carried from the field and taken to the rear, where he died shortly afterwards. Another nearby soldier wounded that day was Lieutenant George E. Dixon, who was shot in his left thigh, but luckily the bullet did not shatter his femur. Such a wound would have resulted in an immediate amputation, and likely would have led to infection and death. Born in New York, he was residing in a Mobile boarding house in 1860 run by Miss Hadner M. Ryan. At the time, he was working as a laborer, as a steamboat engineer on the river. He even became a member of the Mobile Masonic Lodge and the Mobile Greys, a local police force. He would enlist in the 21st Alabama Infantry Regiment in October 1861, where he found himself in the middle of the Shiloh battle in April 1862. However, before boarding the train with his regiment, his young sweetheart or admirer, Miss Queenie Bennett, gave him a gold $20 coin to take with him for good luck. The bullet that struck him during the battle was deflected by that same coin, thus preventing more serious injury and possibly death. He had the words April 6, 1862, Shiloh, my life preserver engraved on the back. Queenie's father was Robert F. Bennett, a steamboat mate who very likely knew Private Thomas Stone's family of steamers. The steamers were a close-knit society, so the two would have known or heard of each other. And surely this would have made for long conversations sitting around the campfire. But history would have it that Lieutenant Dixon below is his reconstructed face became the commander of the world's first submarine, the CSS Hunley, which attacked and sank the USS Housatonic in Charleston on February 17, 1864. Dixon was the one who triggered the explosive device that sank the ship. But unbeknownst to Dixon and his 7 crewmen, they were too close to their target and were all killed instantly from a pulmonary trauma blast. When the wreck was brought to the surface in 2001, the bodies were examined, and the deeply indented $20 gold coin was found next to Dixon's remains. They also found a healed wound on Dixon's left upper thigh with small fragments of lead embedded in the bone. A witness to the raising of the Hunley was Queenie's great-granddaughter, Miss Sally Necessary. Queenie would become a teacher, then a principal in the 1870s and eventually marry William H. Walker in 1871 in Mobile. Another of his crewmen on the Hunley was Private Arnold Becker, who had been assigned to the Confederate gunboat, General Polk, at the beginning of the war. Ironically, one of his shipmates happened to be Lieutenant Sardine Stone. Both men were sent to other duty assignments after the Polk was burned on June 26, 1862, to prevent falling into the enemy's hands. In the meantime, what could have happened to have lost this wonderful chance of crushing General Ulysses Grant and his force at Pittsburgh Landing? Those who were there all echoed the same thought. They blamed chaos within the Southern Command as directly responsible for their staggering casualties. Each corps commander was acting independently with no coordination with any of the others. Bragg himself ordered 8 suicidal frontal attacks on the Union's impregnable position rather than simply attempting to flank it. This is the only Civil War photograph of Private Thomas David Stone. At the time, he was a soldier with the 21st Alabama Infantry Regiment. Now, he lay seriously wounded far from home, as his family waited apprehensively for some word of his survival. Now, here they were listening to the fading crescendo of the artillery, the moaning and shrieking of thousands of wounded left on the fields or scattered throughout the ravines, woods, and encampments. Screams came from the burning underbrush, where many of the wounded were trapped. Their bodies soon smoked from the drenching rain. The dead were everywhere, in heaps and piles. They were tucked into thickets where they had crawled to die alone, and some were even in the branches of the shattered trees where they had been hurled by exploding shells. As soldiers wandered about with lanterns looking for their comrades, an occasional hand would rise and claw at their trouser legs. Disembodied voices rose from the shadows as if from a nightmare. One of those was Private Thomas David Stone, and the other was Lieutenant George E. Dixon. Some demanded relief, others begged to be put out of their misery, but most asked for water, a surgeon, or their mothers. Confederate casualties ran as high as 8,000 for their first day of battle, and many of those still lay where they had fallen. By 3 o'clock on the morning of April 7, the storms began to abate, and things became quiet. But in the quiet solitude, the Confederates could hear the Union reinforcements coming off the rapidly arriving steamboats to the cheers of their surviving comrades. Over 13,000 of Buell's men had arrived fresh off the river and were entering the Union lines. More were disembarking every minute to the dismay of the exhausted Southerners, who had no reserves coming to help them. The surviving soldiers of the 21st Alabama Infantry Regiment would lose 200 of their comrades out of the 650 who had entered the battle. As they looked around at the lifeless and wounded bodies, Confederates and Union soldiers entangled in death, the scene resembled something torn from Dante's Inferno. There was no glory here, no brass bands, no young ladies tossing flowers. There was only the smile of death. The battlefield echoed with the piteous screams of hundreds, boys from both North and South, cries that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Among the fallen was Private Thomas David Stone of Mobile, Alabama. On April 16, 1862, an article appeared in the Mobile paper asking for slightly wounded soldiers to return to duty to assist those who were still shouldering the load. Private Thomas Stone was one of those that was unable to do so.